What can one man do against the darkest powers in history? The life of Karol Józef Wojtyła, known to the world as Saint John Paul II, shows us that when the human heart is fully united with the divine will, it can move heaven and earth and change the course of humanity. This Polish Pope, canonized by the Catholic Church, not only shepherded over 1 billion faithful for 27 years, but with his testimony of unshakable faith, managed to tear down walls, liberate nations, and ignite the flame of hope in the most wounded hearts on the planet. Chapter 1. The early years in Poland. In the small town of Wadowice, Poland, on May 18, 1920, Karol Józef Wojtyła was born, the future pope who would profoundly mark the history of the Church and the world. His childhood unfolded in a deeply Catholic family where his father, a non-commissioned officer in the Polish army, instilled in him from an early age a love for his homeland and for God. The maternal figure of Emilia Kaczorowska, a pious and educated woman, marked the early years of little Karol until Providence took her away when he was only 9 years old. The premature death of his mother did not break young Wojtyła's spirit, but strengthened his relationship with the Blessed Virgin Mary, whom he began to see as his heavenly mother. His father, Karol Wojtyła Sr., became his primary spiritual guide, teaching him to pray the rosary every day and taking him regularly to the parish church of Wadowice. It was common to see the father and son kneeling together before the Blessed Sacrament, unknowingly preparing the heart of the future pontiff for a life of total surrender to Christ. The teenage years brought new trials that tempered his character. Poland was experiencing moments of great political tension, and the threat of war loomed over Europe. However, Karol found in theatre and poetry a way to express his sensitive and profound soul. He actively participated in theatrical performances, where he developed that communication skill that years later would serve him to reach millions of people around the world. His fellow students remember a bright, cheerful, and deeply humane young man. Tragedy struck his life again when he lost his older brother, Edmund, a doctor by profession, who died victim of an epidemic while caring for the sick. This new loss, far from embittering his heart, brought him even closer to Christ crucified. Karol began to understand that suffering, united with that of our Lord, could become a source of redemption and hope. His teachers and friends noticed in him a spiritual maturity uncommon for his age, as if God was preparing him for an extraordinary mission. When World War II broke out in 1939, Karol was 19 years old and studying Polish literature at the Jagiellonian University of Krakow. The Nazi invasion radically changed his life, and that of all Poles. The university was closed, many professors were arrested and deported, and young Wojtyła was forced to work in a quarry and then in a chemical factory to avoid deportation to Germany. However, these years of suffering and humiliation were not wasted time. They were years of purification, where his soul was forged like steel in the fire, preparing for the challenges that the Lord had in store for him. Chapter 2. The priestly calling. During the darkest years of the Nazi occupation, when death roamed the streets of Krakow and hope seemed to fade, the heart of Karol Wojtyła experienced a profound transformation that would change not only his destiny, but that of millions of souls. Working in the quarry and the chemical factory, the young Pole began to feel an inner call that at first he did not know how to interpret. It was as if a silent but persistent voice whispered in his ear, inviting him to follow a path different from the one he had imagined for his life. The death of his father in 1941 marked a definitive turning point in his vocation. Karol found himself completely alone in the world, an orphan at 21. But paradoxically, it was in that solitude where he found the sweetest company, that of Jesus Christ. He spent long hours in prayer before the Blessed Sacrament in the Church of St. Stanislaus Kostka, where little by little he understood that God was calling him to be a priest. It was not a sudden revelation, but a gradual process of discernment that developed between the noise of the machines and the silence of Eucharistic adoration. The contact with Jan Tyranowski, a mystical tailor who led a group of young Catholics, was decisive for his spiritual formation. This simple but deeply spiritual man taught him the secrets of the inner life and revealed to him the riches of Carmelite spirituality, especially devotion to St. John of the Cross. Under his guidance, Carol learned that true freedom does not consist in doing what one wants, but in wanting what God wants. This teaching would become the foundation of his entire priestly and pontifical life. In 1942, with the war still raging at its peak, Carol made the decision that would change his destiny, to enter the clandestine seminary directed by Archbishop Adam Stefan Sapieha. Studies had to be done in secret, as the Nazis had prohibited all religious formation. The seminarians met in private homes, disguised as family gatherings, while studying theology, philosophy, and church history. It was a time when seeking holiness was literally an act of heroic resistance against the forces of evil. The seminary years were of intense intellectual and spiritual formation. Carol excelled especially in Thomistic philosophy, finding in St. Thomas Aquinas a sure teacher to understand the relationship between faith and reason. At the same time, he developed a deep Marian devotion that would mark his entire life. His fellow seminarians remember a serious but cheerful young man who combined intense prayer with moments of healthy recreation. Already then, one could glimpse in him that unique ability to unite spiritual depth with human closeness that would characterize him as Pope. Chapter 3. The Young Priest. On November 1st, 1946, the Feast of All Saints, Karol Wojtyła was ordained a priest by Cardinal Adam Stefan Sapieha in the private chapel of the Archbishop's Palace of Krakow. That grey autumn day would become one of the brightest in the history of the Church. Although no one then could imagine that they were witnessing the ordination of a future Pope and Saint, the young priest celebrated his first Mass in the crypt of St. Leonard at Wawel Cathedral, before the tomb of St. Stanislaus, the patron saint of Poland. It was as if Providence, even then, was signaling his destiny as a shepherd for the entire Church. Immediately after his ordination, Father Wojtyła was sent to Rome to pursue doctoral studies in theology at the Angelicum. For 2 years, the young Polish priest lived at the Belgian College, from where he could closely observe the workings of the Universal Church. He seized every free moment to visit the catacombs, the basilicas, and the holy sites of the Eternal City, immersing himself in that 2,000-year-old tradition that he would later safeguard as the successor of Peter. His doctoral thesis on faith in St. John of the Cross already revealed his profound understanding of mystical life and his ability to unite academic theology with spiritual experience. Upon returning to Poland in 1948, he was assigned as a parish vicar to Negowicz, a small rural town where he exercised his ministry with extraordinary apostolic zeal. The farmers of that region, accustomed to older priests with more traditional ways, were initially surprised by this young pastor, who didn't hesitate to play touch football with the boys after teaching them catechism. However, they soon discovered in him an authentic shepherd who knew their names, their struggles, and their hopes. His homilies, profound yet accessible, touched the hearts of the simplest and the most learned. A year later, he was transferred to St. Florian's University Parish in Krakow, where his ministry with young university students flourished extraordinarily. Father Wojtyła, who was barely 29 years old, organized excursions to the mountains, where he combined intellectual formation with athletic adventure. During hikes through the Tatras or the Carpathians, he taught philosophy and theology, while skiing or hiking. The students affectionately called him Uncle, and many of them would cherish throughout their lives. The memory of those conversations around the campfire, where they learned that the Christian faith was not something boring, but the most exciting adventure a human being could experience. His pastoral method was revolutionary for the time. Instead of preaching solely from the pulpit, he sought more informal meeting places where young people felt free to ask questions and express their doubts. He organized study groups where social and political issues were analyzed from the perspective of the gospel. During the summers, he organized kayak trips down the Polish rivers, moments of profound communion where friendships were born that would last a lifetime, and religious vocations that would enrich the church. Already then, that unique ability to be completely of God and completely human at the same time was manifested in him. If this story of the glorious St. John Paul II is igniting in your heart a love for Christ and a desire to be holy, we invite you to say a Hail Mary for our mission of evangelization. You can support us through the Super Thanks button here on YouTube. May St. John Paul II intercede for you, and may the Sacred Heart of Jesus, whom this Holy Pope loved so much, bless you abundantly. Let us continue discovering how this courageous shepherd transformed every moment of his life into an eternal testimony of hope and holiness. Chapter 4. Bishop and Cardinal of Krakow. In 1958, at the age of 38, Karol Wojtyła received news that would radically change his life. Pope Pius I had appointed him auxiliary bishop of Krakow. The news caught him by surprise while enjoying a kayaking vacation with his young university students. When he returned and found Cardinal Wyszynski's letter communicating the pontifical decision, his first reaction was of profound humility and a certain fear. He considered himself too young and inexperienced for such a high responsibility, but his spiritual director helped him understand that when God calls, he also grants the necessary graces to fulfill the mission entrusted to him. On September 28, 1958, he was consecrated bishop in Wawel Cathedral by Archbishop Eugeniusz Baziak. During the ceremony, he chose Totus Tuus, totally yours, as his episcopal motto, an expression of his total consecration to the Blessed Virgin Mary, according to the spirituality of Saint Louis Marie Grignon de Montfort. These two words, embroidered by his spiritual mother in Latin, would become the guiding thread of his entire episcopal and pontifical life. From that day on, everything in him belonged to Mary, so that she might lead him more perfectly to Jesus. As auxiliary bishop, Monsignor Wojtyła demonstrated an extraordinary pastoral capacity that soon distinguished him among his brothers in the episcopate. He was particularly concerned with workers and intellectuals, two groups that, under the communist regime, lived in particularly difficult situations. He regularly visited factories where he celebrated clandestine masses and offered spiritual formation to the workers. At the same time, he maintained a constant dialogue with university professors and artists, helping them to find in the Christian faith not an obstacle to their creativity, but its most authentic source. In 1962, he participated in the Second Vatican Council as one of the youngest bishops of the Conciliar Assembly. His intervention in the debates on religious freedom and the dignity of the human person drew the attention of the Council Fathers for its theological depth and his direct pastoral experience. With the effects of totalitarianism, during the 4 sessions of the Council, he established contacts with bishops from all over the world and developed that universal vision of the Church that would later characterize his pontificate. His contributions to the constitution Gaudium et Spes on the Church in the contemporary world were especially valuable. In 1964, at the age of 44, he was appointed Archbishop of Krakow, becoming the shepherd of one of the most important archdioceses in Poland. 3 years later, Pope Paul VI created him cardinal, being the second youngest in the College of Cardinals. As Archbishop of Krakow, he developed a pastoral style that combined doctrinal firmness with human closeness. He valiantly confronted the communist regime, defending the rights of the Church and the faithful, but always with that prudence and wisdom that avoided unnecessary confrontations. His cathedral became a spiritual refuge for thousands of people who found in his homilies and in his paternal presence the necessary strength to persevere in the faith despite the difficulties. Chapter 5. The Polish Pope, October 16, 1978, will forever be etched in the history of the Church as the day divine providence surprised the entire world. After the death of Pope John Paul I, after only 33 days as pontiff, the cardinals gathered again in conclave to elect the 264th successor of Peter. No one expected them to choose a Polish pope. For over 4 centuries, all the pontiffs had been Italian. However, the Holy Spirit had a surprise prepared that would change not only the history of the Church, but that of the entire world. When Cardinal Pericle Felici announced from the central loggia of St. Peter's Basilica, Annuncio vobis gaudium magnum, habemus papam, and pronounced the name Karol Józef Wojtyła, a stunned silence spread across St. Peter's Square. It took the crowd a few seconds to understand that for the first time in modern history, a non-Italian pope had been elected. When the new pontiff appeared on the balcony and greeted the crowd with those words that would become historic. I don't know if I can explain myself well in our Italian language. The Roman people welcomed him with an immediate affection that would grow into veneration. Pope John Paul II, the name he chose in honor of his predecessor, began his pontificate with an energy and a vision that revolutionized the papacy. His first encyclical, Redemptor Hominis, presented the program for his pontificate, centered on Jesus Christ as the Redeemer of man and on the inalienable dignity of every human person. From the beginning, it was clear that this pope would not be content with being a spiritual leader locked in the Vatican, but would go out to meet humanity, carrying the message of Christ to the ends of the earth. His first apostolic journey to Mexico in January 1979 marked the beginning of a new era in the exercise of the Petrine ministry. The massive welcome he received in Mexican lands proved that a new style of being pope had been born. John Paul II not only preached about the universality of the Church, but he embodied it, traveling personally to all the continents. His physical presence in the most diverse places on the planet carried a powerful message. The Catholic Church knows no borders of race, culture, or social condition. It is truly universal. The return to his native Poland in June 1979 constituted an event of historic proportions that no one had foreseen. Millions of Poles took to the streets to receive their Pope, and for 9 days the country experienced a sense of freedom and dignity that many believed impossible under the communist regime. The Pope's homilies in Victory Square in Warsaw, in Częstochowa before the Black Madonna, and in Krakow, his episcopal city, were not only religious events, but moments of national awakening that planted the seeds for the future liberation of Poland. Without uttering a single directly political word, John Paul II had demonstrated that no totalitarian system can forever chain the human spirit when it is rooted in the truth of Christ. Chapter 6. Pilgrim of Faith. John Paul II became the most traveled pope in history, making 104 apostolic journeys that took him to 129 countries during his 27 years as pontiff. Each trip was a true evangelizing mission. where the successor of Peter personally carried the message of Christ to peoples and cultures of all continents. His motto, Duc in altum, meaning put out into the deep, was not only a spiritual invitation, but a program of action that drove him to cross all the oceans, to reach every corner of the earth, where there was a soul in need of hope. His trips to Africa were especially significant, as he brought the message of human dignity to a continent that was suffering under the weight of poverty, wars, and racial discrimination. In South Africa, during the years of apartheid, his words against racism resonated like a prophetic thunder that helped accelerate the end of that unjust system. In African countries ravaged by famine and disease, his presence was like a balm, reminding the poorest of the poor that they were not forgotten by God. His embrace of lepers, his blessing of malnourished children, and his prayer with refugees showed the world the merciful face of Christ. In Asia, a continent where Christians are a minority, John Paul II brought a message of dialogue and respect towards the great Eastern religions, without ever renouncing the clear proclamation of the gospel. His visits to countries such as India, Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines strengthened the local Christian communities and opened new spaces for religious freedom. In every Asian country he visited, he demonstrated that Christianity is not a Western religion, but a universal faith that can be embodied in any culture, respecting its authentic values and purifying those elements contrary to human dignity. The visits to Latin America were particularly emotional, as this continent was home to almost half of the world's Catholics. In every Latin American country, from Mexico to Argentina, John Paul II found a deep popular faith, but one in need of purification and strengthening. His encounters with indigenous communities were memorable, as he recognized their ancestral cultures while denouncing the historical injustices they had suffered. In Brazil, in Peru, in Guatemala, and in so many other countries, his voice rose like that of a modern prophet, defending the poor and oppressed, but always from the perspective of the gospel, never from political ideologies. In Europe, both Western and Eastern, John Paul II was a tireless promoter of Christian unity and reconciliation between peoples. His trips to Protestant countries such as Germany, England, and the Scandinavian countries were important steps on the ecumenical path. But his trips to the Eastern European countries were especially significant, where the fall of communism allowed him to visit nations that for decades had been closed to the gospel. In every European capital he visited, John Paul II recalled the Christian roots of the continent and called on Europeans not to forget their spiritual heritage in the construction of the new, unified Europe. Chapter 7. Defender of Human Dignity. Throughout his pontificate, John Paul II stood as the great defender of the dignity of the human person, in a world that seemed to have lost the sense of the sacred value of every life. His pontifical teachings, expressed in 13 encyclicals and numerous apostolic exhortations, constituted a systematic and profound defense of the human person against all the threats of modernity. From the very beginning of his pontificate, it became clear that this pope would not limit himself to purely religious questions, but would apply the light of the gospel to all the problems that affected human dignity. His encyclical Laborem Exercens, 1981, revolutionized the social doctrine of the Church. By delving into the meaning of human labor as participation in God's creative work in a world divided between capitalism and communism, St. John Paul II presented a third way, based on the dignity of the worker and on the primacy of the person over capital and over the state. His teachings on work especially resonated with the hearts of workers around the globe, who found in this Polish Pope, who had worked in a quarry and a factory, someone who truly understood their struggles and aspirations. The defense of human life, from conception to natural death, became one of the most important banners of his pontificate. His encyclical Evangelium Vitae, 1995, was a passionate defense of life against the culture of death that was spreading throughout the developed world. St. John Paul II did not simply repeat the traditional teachings of the Church, but deepened them, showing the anthropological and theological roots of the defense of life. His words against abortion, euthanasia, and the death penalty resonated as the voice of the moral conscience of humanity. In the realm of human rights, St. John Paul II became a prophetic voice, denouncing all forms of oppression and discrimination. His support for liberation movements in Eastern Europe was decisive for the fall of communism, but he also defended human rights in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. During his apostolic journeys, he did not hesitate to denounce military dictatorships, apartheid systems, and all forms of totalitarianism that trampled on the dignity of individuals. His moral authority extended beyond Catholics, being recognized by leaders of all religions and ideologies as an authentic defender of humanity. The promotion of world peace was another of his constant concerns. St. John Paul II intervened in numerous international conflicts, offering the mediation of the Holy See and always calling for dialogue and reconciliation. His historic visit to the Synagogue of Rome in 1986, his prayer meeting for peace in Assisi with representatives of all the world's religions, and his gestures of reconciliation with the Orthodox churches and Protestant communities showed that the defense of human dignity necessarily includes the search for unity among all God's children. In a world marked by religious and ethnic conflicts, St. John Paul II demonstrated that authentic faith does not divide, but unites people in the pursuit of the common good. Chapter 8. The Pope of the Young. From the early days of his pontificate, St. John Paul II demonstrated a special connection with young people. That would become one of the most distinctive characteristics of his papal ministry. His experience as a young priest in Krakow, where he had developed an innovative pastoral method, combining intellectual formation with sports and cultural activities, had taught him that young people are not looking for a diluted or easy Christianity, but for demanding proposals that give meaning to their lives. This pastoral intuition became one of the fundamental pillars of his pontificate. The creation of World Youth Days in 1985 was one of the most brilliant and lasting initiatives of St. John Paul II. The first day, celebrated in Rome during Palm Sunday of 1985, brought together 300,000 young people from around the world in St. Peter's Square. The success was so extraordinary that it was decided to repeat the experience every 2 or 3 years in different cities around the globe. These days became true eruptions of youthful faith that showed the world that the Catholic Church was not an aging institution, but a living and young community. At each World Youth Day, St. John Paul II presented young people with the highest challenges of the gospel, without lowering the demands of the Christian life. In Santiago de Compostela, 1989, Denver, 1993, Manila, 1995, Paris, 1997, Rome, 2000, and Toronto, 2002, millions of young people of all nationalities and cultures responded to the papal call, with an enthusiasm that surprised even the most skeptical observers. The Pope did not promise them an easy life, but a life full of meaning. He did not offer them immediate pleasures, but the profound joy of serving Christ and their brothers and sisters. His message to young people was always the same, but expressed with a freshness and a passion that reached directly to the heart. Do not be afraid to be saints. These words, repeated in all languages and on all continents, became the motto of a generation of young Catholics who found in St. John Paul II not only a religious leader, but a spiritual father who believed in their possibilities and encouraged them to give the best of themselves. The Pope had the unique ability to make each young person feel that they were personally loved by God and called to a specific mission in the Church and in the world. The beatifications and canonizations of young saints during his pontificate were another manifestation of his confidence in the capacity for holiness of youth. Pier Giorgio Frassati, José Luis Sánchez del Rio, Francisco and Jacinta Marto, and many other young people were proposed as models of Christian life for the new generations. St. John Paul II demonstrated that holiness is not the exclusive heritage of older people or past eras, but is possible here and now for any young person who opens their heart completely to Christ. His confidence in young people was so great that he did not hesitate to entrust them with the most important tasks of evangelization, making them protagonists of the new evangelization that he so longed for the third millennium. Chapter 9. Witness to Suffering. On May 13, 1981, the feast day of Our Lady of Fatima, a dramatic event changed the life of St. John Paul II forever and profoundly marked his pontificate. While greeting the faithful in St. Peter's Square during the general audience, the Turkish terrorist Mehmet Ali Aka fired several shots at the Pope, seriously wounding him in the abdomen, arm, and hand. The image of the pontiff collapsing in the Pope-mobile while his secretary held him went around the world in minutes, plunging millions of Catholics into prayer and anguish. During those long hours of surgery at Gemelli Hospital, as doctors fought to save his life, John Paul II maintained a serenity that astonished everyone present. His first words upon awakening were of forgiveness for his attacker and thanksgiving to the Blessed Virgin Mary, to whom he attributed his survival. A maternal hand guided the bullet's path, he would later say, convinced that the Blessed Virgin had diverted the projectiles so they wouldn't strike any vital organs. This experience further strengthened his Marian devotion and his conviction that his life belonged entirely to Christ. Through Mary, the assassination attempt, far from weakening his ministry, strengthened it in an extraordinary way. John Paul II understood that he had been saved to fulfill a specific mission in the history of salvation. His suffering was mystically united with that of Christ crucified, becoming a source of grace for the universal church. His visit to Mehmet Ali Aka in Rabibia prison on December 27, 1983, became one of the most powerful images of his papacy, the Pope, dressed in white, conversing softly with his assailant, offering Christian forgiveness in a personal and direct way. The years following the assassination attempt were marked by intense apostolic activity, as if John Paul II wanted to seize every moment of life that God had granted him. However, physical suffering became his constant companion. The after effects of the attack, coupled with a fall in 1993 that fractured his femur, and later the development of Parkinson's disease, gradually transformed the vigorous Pope of his early years into a man marked by pain, but not defeated by it. His way of living with suffering became a living lesson, a catechesis on the redemptive value of Christian pain. Instead of hiding himself when his illness became more evident, John Paul II continued to appear in public, allowing the entire world to witness. How an authentic Christian accepts the cross, not with passive resignation, but with active hope. His trembling hands blessing the faithful, his voice growing weaker, but always filled with love, and his face etched with suffering, but illuminated by inner peace, were a sermon more eloquent than any homily on the paschal mystery of Christ. Chapter 10. The Fall of Communism. John Paul II played a fundamental role in the fall of communism in Eastern Europe, not through political machinations, but through the moral force of the gospel and the testimony of truth. His pontificate coincided with the final years of the Cold War, and from the outset, it was clear that the presence of a Polish pope on the throne of Peter would introduce an entirely new element into the global geopolitical balance. However, John Paul II never conceived of himself as a political leader, but as a shepherd of souls, preaching the freedom that comes from Christ. His first trip to Poland in June 1979, just 8 months after his election, was the first decisive blow against the communist system. For 9 days, millions of Poles rediscovered their Christian and national identity in the massive celebrations that accompanied the Pope's visits to Warsaw, Gniezno, Częstochowa, and Krakow. John Paul II's homilies did not contain direct attacks on the communist regime, but his message about the dignity of the human person, the importance of religious freedom, and the right of peoples to preserve their cultural identity undermined the very ideological foundations of Marxist totalitarianism. The birth of the Solidarity Trade Union in August 1980, led by Lech Wałęsa, found decisive moral support in John Paul II. Although the Pope never directly involved himself in the union's activities, his teachings on workers' rights and the dignity of human labor provided the theoretical basis for Polish peaceful resistance. When General Wojciech Jaruzelski declared martial law in December 1981, John Paul II became the voice of the moral conscience of the Polish people, encouraging non-violent resistance and keeping the hope of freedom alive. His second trip to Poland in 1983, in the midst of martial law, demonstrated that no human power could silence the voice of the Vicar of Christ. Despite government restrictions, millions of Poles flocked to meet the Pope, turning each celebration into a silent yet powerful demonstration against oppression. The communist government was forced to allow papal visits because prohibiting them would have provoked a popular revolt, but each of John Paul II's trips to his homeland further weakened the regime and strengthened the democratic opposition. The Pope's influence extended beyond Poland to all of Eastern Europe. His meetings with Soviet leaders, especially with Mikhail Gorbachev in 1989, helped create a climate of dialogue that facilitated democratic reforms. When the Berlin Wall fell on November 9, 1989, many recognized that the prayers and testimony of John Paul II had been as important as political decisions in making that historic moment possible. The Pope, who had begun his pontificate asking, "Be not afraid," had helped liberate half a continent from the fear that had paralyzed millions of people under the communist yoke for decades. Chapter 11. The Final Years. The final years of John Paul II's pontificate were marked by a heroic struggle against physical deterioration, which became increasingly evident to the eyes of the entire world. Parkinson's disease, which had become publicly apparent in the mid-1990s, progressed relentlessly, transforming the Pope, who had traveled the world with tireless energy, into an elderly man who needed help to walk and speak. However, these years of apparent weakness became some of the most spiritually fruitful of his entire pontificate. The great jubilee of the year 2000 was the culmination of his pontifical magisterium and the fulfillment of one of his most cherished dreams, to lead the Church into the third Christian millennium, completely renewed in its faith and in its evangelizing mission. Despite his physical limitations, John Paul II personally presided over all the great Jubilee celebrations, from the opening of the Holy Door on Christmas Eve of 1999 to its closing on January 6, 2001. His catecheses on Christian hope during that holy year resonated with particular force because they came from a man who had made hope the engine of his entire life. The September 11, 2001 attacks in New York and Washington found in John Paul II a prophet of peace, who denounced terrorism as a diabolical manifestation of evil, but who at the same time called on humanity not to respond to violence with more violence. His messages during those dramatic days showcased the wisdom of a universal shepherd, who understood that the world needed spiritual healing more than political revenge. His opposition to the Iraq War in 2003 confirmed his consistency as a peace builder, willing to stand up even to world powers. When justice and truth were at stake, the increase in beatifications and canonizations during those final years revealed another dimension of his legacy. John Paul II wanted to show the world that holiness is not an unattainable ideal, but a goal within reach of every authentic Christian. He beatified 1,140 individuals and canonized 482 saints, more than all his predecessors combined over several centuries. Among them were people of all ages, social backgrounds, and nationalities, demonstrating that holiness is truly universal and that God calls all his children to the fullness of the Christian life. His last public appearances, especially during Holy Week of 2005, were a moving testament to how an authentic Christian prepares for the ultimate encounter with Christ. The image of the Pope at the window of his apartments, attempting to bless the faithful in St. Peter's Square, but unable to articulate words, became a silent sermon on the total surrender of one's life to God. On April 2nd, 2005, the Saturday of the octave of Easter and the eve of Divine Mercy Sunday, a feast he himself had instituted, John Paul II surrendered his soul to God, fulfilling his desire expressed years earlier to be called to the Father's house during the Easter season. Chapter 12. Prayer to St. John Paul II. O glorious St. John Paul II, Pope of hope and heroic witness of Christ's love, you who traveled the whole world, bringing the light of the gospel to all peoples, intercede for us before the throne of the Most High. You who knew how to unite in your heart the depth of contemplation with the burning zeal of apostolic action, help us to live our Christian faith with the same generous dedication that characterized your entire priestly and pontifical life. Holy Father John Paul II, you who were a model of Christian forgiveness, when you publicly forgave the one who tried to take your life, teach us to forgive the offenses we receive and to respond to evil with good. You who experienced in your own flesh the mystery of redemptive suffering, accompany all the sick and afflicted of the world, so that they may find in their pain a participation in the saving passion of our Lord Jesus Christ. O St. John Paul II, tireless defender of the dignity of the human person, from conception to natural death, protect all the families of the world and help them to discover the beauty of God's plan for marriage and life. You who especially loved young people and fearlessly propose to them the highest ideals of the gospel, inspire the new generations so that they are not afraid to be saints and become protagonists of the new evangelization. Holy Father, you who had a filial devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary and placed your entire pontificate under her maternal protection with the motto Totus Tuus, lead us by the hand to Jesus, as Mary led the disciples at Cana of Galilee. May your powerful intercession before the throne of grace obtain for us the necessary strength to live our faith consistently in a world that seems to have forgotten God. St. John Paul II, Pilgrim Pope and tireless evangelizer, pray for the Holy Catholic Church, that it may always be faithful to its mission to proclaim the gospel to the ends of the earth. Intercede especially for the Roman Pontiff, for all bishops, priests, deacons, religious men and women, that they may be authentic witnesses of the risen Christ. May your example of pastoral holiness inspire all the ministers of the Church to dedicate themselves completely to the service of God's people, never seeking their own glory, but only the greater glory of Christ and the salvation of souls. O holy Polish Pope, who knew how to be completely of God and completely human, help all of us Christians to live with joy our baptismal vocation, knowing that we are called to be saints As our Heavenly Father is holy, through your intercession, may the Lord grant peace to the world, unity to divided Christians, and conversion to all those who do not yet know the merciful love of God. Amen.